Right now, there is a patch of the Pacific Ocean that is the wrong colour. Not a shadow, not a trick of the light. A vast, spreading stain in the open sea, hundreds of miles from the nearest city, and a satellite photographed it earlier today. Floating on that water are rafts of solid rock, and underneath all of it, something has been erupting without pause for more than 2 weeks straight. Almost nobody is talking about it. But the people who are watching this closely have started asking a genuinely staggering question. Are we witnessing the birth of a brand new island? Tonight we walk through every piece of evidence, from the floating stone to the earthquake swarm climbing the wrong way, and you will see exactly why this is so hard to call. Before we go any further, if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our nightly debriefs, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight. Now let's get into it. Part 1. The Stain on the Sea. Right now, as you're watching this, there is a patch of the Pacific Ocean that is the wrong colour. It is not a trick of the light. It is not a shadow from a cloud, or a bloom of algae, or anything else with a gentle, ordinary explanation. It is a vast, spreading discoloration in the open sea, hundreds of miles from the nearest city, and a satellite passing overhead photographed it earlier today. The water there has turned a strange, milky, sediment-heavy shade that simply does not belong on an ocean surface, and the stained area is not holding still, it is growing. Every image we get shows it a little larger than the image before. If you could stand on the deck of a ship at that exact spot, you would see something stranger still. You would see rafts of rock floating on the water, actual stone, drifting on the surface of the sea like scattered gravel resting impossibly on the top of a pond, gathered into patches and long ribbons that stretch off toward the horizon. You would feel the swell move differently underfoot, because the water itself is being disturbed from below, pushed and stirred by something you cannot see. You might catch the sharp, mineral smell of sulphur on the wind, and if you stayed there long enough and watched carefully enough, you would slowly come to understand that you were standing directly above something that has been erupting, without pause, without rest, for more than 2 weeks straight. This is the Central Bismarck Sea. It sits in the southwest Pacific, in the stretch of ocean north of the great island of New Guinea and south of a scattering of smaller islands called the Admiralty Islands. It belongs, on the maps and in the legal sense, to the nation of Papua New Guinea. But in every way that actually matters for this story, it belongs to almost no one. There are no cities here. There are no coastal towns lining a sheltered bay, no harbours crowded with fishing boats, no webcams bolted to a hillside and pointed patiently at the water. The nearest place with a name that most of us could even begin to find on a map is a town called Lorengau on Manus Island. And even Lorengau is far enough away that what is happening out here has, for 2 full weeks, been almost completely invisible to the rest of the world. This is, in the most literal sense, a blank spot, an unwatched corner of the planet. It is worth understanding what kind of place the Bismarck Sea actually is, geologically, because it is not a random stretch of water. It is one of the most tectonically violent neighbourhoods on the entire planet. This is a region where pieces of the Earth's crust are colliding, grinding, and tearing past one another at rates that are fast by geological standards. It sits within the broader Pacific Ring of Fire, that vast horseshoe-shaped belt of earthquakes and volcanoes that traces the rim of the Pacific Ocean. And within that already restless belt, the seas around Papua New Guinea are a particular hotspot of activity. The crust here is broken into a mosaic of smaller plates and microplates, all jostling against one another, and the boundaries between them are marked by trenches where crust dives down into the planet, and by ridges where new crust is born, and by faults where the ground slides and lurches. Volcanoes, both above the water and beneath it, are scattered all through this region as a direct consequence. So when something erupts on the floor of the Central Bismarck Sea, it is not an anomaly, not a freak event out of nowhere. It is this part of the planet doing exactly what this part of the planet does. What makes Titan Ridge worth a video is not that it erupted at all. It is what the eruption has been doing in the 2 weeks since. The thing that is erupting in that unwatched corner has a name. The people who have been tracking it have started calling it Titan Ridge. It is not a mountain you have heard of because it is not a mountain you can see. It is an undersea volcanic feature, a piece of the planet's deep machinery that sits entirely below the waves, and until very recently it did not feature in anyone's daily attention at all. It does now. Because on the 8th of May 2026, Titan Ridge woke up, and it has not gone back to sleep since. The most recent hard evidence we have comes from a satellite called Himawari 9. Himawari 9 is a Japanese weather satellite, and it occupies a special kind of orbit, a fixed position high above the Western Pacific that lets it stare down at the same enormous patch of the Earth all day, every day, without ever moving on. It is in effect an unblinking eye permanently aimed at this part of the world, and its imagery from the 22nd of May shows the discoloration clearly and unambiguously. A large, irregular, expanding plume of off-colour water centred on the eruption site, bleeding steadily outward into the surrounding ocean. When you place that image next to the imagery from earlier in the month, the conclusion becomes very hard to avoid. The stain is not fading, it is not breaking up, it is spreading. Whatever is happening down there on the seafloor is not winding down toward an ending. It is, if anything, doing more than it was doing a week ago. And here is the first genuinely strange thing about this story. The thing that sets it apart from almost every other volcanic eruption you have ever seen footage of in your life. There is no mountain. There is no glowing crater rim. There is no fountain of orange lava arcing into a black night sky. No towering column of ash boiling up over a terrified town. None of the imagery that the single word eruption immediately and automatically places into your mind. Everything that is happening at Titan Ridge is happening underwater. The eruption is real, it is large, it is sustained, and it is almost entirely hidden because the ocean is sitting on top of it like an enormous heavy lid, absorbing the light and the sound and the fury and letting almost nothing through. That, right there, is the honest answer to the question this video is named after. That is why you have not heard about this. A volcano that does not produce a dramatic photograph does not produce a headline. A volcano on the floor of one of the emptiest, most remote stretches of ocean on the entire planet does not produce much of anything that a news camera can point at and use, so it has been erupting for more than 2 weeks in near total silence. The data has been there the whole time, openly published, freely available, sitting in plain sight for anyone who knew where to look and cared enough to look there. But the world, by and large, has simply not looked. We have. If you have been following this channel, you already know that, because this is not the first time we have stood over this exact patch of the Central Bismarck Sea. We were here on the very day this eruption began, when the news of it first surfaced in the data. We came back a week later, when the volcano was struck by a powerful earthquake while it was still actively erupting. And we are here again tonight, on the 22nd of May, because the story has reached its next chapter. And this chapter, as you are about to see, is the one that genuinely matters most. Because the question now hanging over Titan Ridge is no longer simply whether it is erupting. We know that it is erupting. We have known that for 2 weeks. The real question, the one that should make you sit forward slightly, is what that eruption is building. There is a real, serious, evidence-backed possibility, and I want you to notice how carefully I'm choosing that word, possibility, that what is happening on the floor of the Central Bismarck Sea right now is the birth of a brand new island. A genuine physical piece of land that did not exist a month ago. A new addition to the map of the world, assembling itself in the cold and the dark, rising slowly and silently toward the surface of the sea. And there is a second possibility, running quietly alongside the first one the entire time, that what we are watching is not the gentle creation of new land at all, but instead the early, unmistakable signature of something far more dangerous loading itself beneath the waves. I want to be honest with you, right here at the start, about the spirit in which we are going to explore those two possibilities, because it matters. This is not a video designed to frighten you, and it is not a video designed to sell you a fantasy. Both of those would be easy, and both would be dishonest. The easy fear version would tell you a catastrophe is coming and leave out every uncertainty. The easy wonder version would promise you a beautiful new island and ignore the hazard entirely. The real story is neither of those, and it is more interesting than both, because the real story is genuinely unresolved. We're going to look at every piece of evidence as it actually is. Where the evidence leans towards something dramatic, we will say so. Where the evidence is thin or poor or pointing 2 ways at once, we will say that too, plainly. By the end of this video, you're not going to have a tidy answer, because a tidy answer does not exist yet. What you're going to have is something better, a clear, honest map of exactly what we know, exactly what we do not, and exactly what the coming weeks will reveal. That is the deal. That is what this channel is for. Those two possibilities are the spine of everything that follows in this video. An island being born, or a hazard being assembled. Quiet creation, or quiet escalation. And the genuinely unsettling truth is that, standing here on the 22nd of May, with the data we currently have in hand, nobody on Earth can tell you for certain which one of those it is. We are going to walk through every single piece of evidence we have. You're going to see exactly why this is so difficult to call, exactly what each clue points toward, and exactly what the next few weeks of observation are going to reveal. But before any of that, we have to answer a much simpler question first, and it is a question that, on its face, sounds almost impossible to answer at all. If this entire thing is happening underwater, in the middle of nowhere, with no mountain and no camera, and not a single person standing anywhere nearby, then how does anyone know it is happening at all? How do you watch a volcano that you fundamentally cannot see? Part 2. How you watch. A volcano you cannot see. Think for a moment about what an underwater eruption actually does to hide itself. A volcano on land is loud, in every possible sense of that word. It produces light, the glow of lava, the flash of explosions. It produces a shape on the horizon, a recognizable cone that has been there for 1,000 years. It produces an ash cloud you can see from a passing airliner, from 100 miles away from space. It produces a roar and a rumble that can be heard and felt in the chest for great distances around. A volcano on land announces itself to the entire region. A submarine volcano produces almost none of that, because the ocean systematically erases all of it. The water swallows the sound. The water absorbs and scatters the light until nothing reaches the surface. The water flattens the eruption into a faint disturbance that you might not even consciously notice if you sailed a ship straight across the top of it. A submarine eruption is, in a very real and practical sense, a volcano with the volume turned almost all the way down. So the people whose job it is to monitor this part of the world have had to become genuinely expert at something that sounds paradoxical. They have had to learn how to watch a volcano they will never actually see with their own eyes. And the way they do it is clever, and it is worth understanding in detail, because it relies on the eruption betraying its own presence in 3 completely different ways, all at the same time. The first way is sound, but not the kind of sound you're imagining. When a volcano erupts, even from beneath the sea, it pushes a tremendous amount of energy upward, and some of that energy makes it through the water, reaches the atmosphere, and then travels through the air as extremely low-frequency pressure waves. These are sound waves, technically speaking, but they are far, far too low in pitch for any human ear to ever detect. We call this infrasound. It is, in a sense, the deep, slow, rumbling heartbeat of the planet itself, a register of sound that exists below the floor of human hearing. And infrasound has a remarkable property. It travels enormous distances through the atmosphere with very little loss, because these long, slow wavelengths are not easily absorbed or stopped by anything in their path. Scattered around the entire world, there is a network of extraordinarily sensitive instruments built specifically to listen for it. They were originally designed, in large part, to catch the unmistakable infrasound signature of secret nuclear weapons tests anywhere on Earth. But it turns out they're just as good at catching the infrasound signature of an erupting volcano. And that is precisely how the beginning of this eruption was pinned down. Nobody was out there in the Central Bismarck Sea at 1:15 in the morning on the 8th of May. There was no observer on a ship. There was no camera. There was no one standing on a nearby shore. But the infrasound sensors heard it. They registered the low, slow, distinctive pressure pulse of a volcanic eruption beginning, and from that signal alone the start of the Titan Ridge eruption was timed to roughly 1:15 in the morning, local time, on the 8th of May, 2026. I want you to sit with that for just a moment, because it is genuinely remarkable. The exact birth time of this entire event is known, not because any human being witnessed it, not because anyone was there, but because the eruption announced itself in a frequency of sound too low for us to hear, and a patient network of instruments was listening carefully on exactly that frequency the entire time. The volcano whispered, in a voice below human hearing, and the machines were listening. There is something genuinely worth appreciating in that fact, something almost philosophical, before we move on. We tend to think of discovery as a visual act. We imagine the explorer seeing the new coastline, the astronomer seeing the new planet through the lens. but a great deal of what humanity actually knows about its own planet, it knows without ever having seen. We have never laid eyes directly on the core of the Earth, yet we know its size, its composition, and that part of it is liquid, because we read the way earthquake waves bend as they pass through it. We have never seen the inside of a thundercloud's electrical structure, yet we map it through the signals it broadcasts. And here, in the Bismarck Sea, we know the precise minute a volcano began to erupt, in a place no human being was watching, because the eruption broadcast a signal in a register below hearing, and a network of patient machines was tuned to receive it. That is not a lesser form of knowledge than seeing. In many ways, it is a more powerful one, because it lets us know things that no eye could ever reach. Hold on to that idea, because it is the foundation of everything that follows. We are about to make a series of careful inferences about a volcano none of us will ever see. And the reason those inferences are trustworthy is that this is how the Earth is studied and it works. The body responsible for keeping watch over this particular corner of the Pacific is called the Rabaul Volcano Observatory. Rabaul is a town in Papua New Guinea, and it is a town with its own long and genuinely violent volcanic history. It sits in the shadow of volcanoes that have reshaped it more than once. The observatory based there is the institution that monitors the volcanoes of this whole region, including the submarine ones, the hidden ones, the ones that almost no one else in the world ever thinks about. It was their analysis that nailed down the onset of this eruption from the infrasound record, and once they knew the eruption had begun, they had two more independent ways of watching it continue to unfold. The second way is colour. We have already touched on the discoloured water, but it is genuinely worth understanding exactly why it appears, because it is not a vague or a mysterious thing at all. It is a direct, predictable physical consequence of what an erupting submarine volcano does to the seawater around it. When magma and superheated rock meet cold seawater at the vent, several things happen at once. The eruption heats the surrounding water dramatically. It loads that water with dissolved minerals, with sulfur compounds, and with a fine suspension of pulverized volcanic particles, rock ground down to a powder. That heated, mineral-saturated, particle-clouded water is now significantly less dense than the cold, clear, ordinary ocean around it. And anything less dense than its surroundings rises. So the plume of altered water rises, sometimes from very great depth, all the way up through the water column to the surface of the sea, and when it finally gets there it spreads outward, and from above, from the vantage point of a satellite, that spreading plume reads as a stain. A patch of ocean that is simply the wrong colour. The discoloured water is not a side effect of the eruption, not really. It is the eruption itself made visible. It is the one and only part of this entire violent process that ever manages to reach a place where a camera can actually see it. And this is exactly where the imagery from the 22nd of May becomes so important, and why we keep returning to it. It is not merely that the water near Titan Ridge is discoloured. It is that the discoloured area is expanding. That single fact carries a great deal of weight. A submarine eruption that was genuinely fading, winding down toward its end, would produce a discoloration plume that was shrinking, getting thinner, getting paler, breaking apart and dispersing as the supply of hot, mineral-rich water from the vent below tapered off and finally stopped. That is simply not what the Himawari 9 imagery shows us. It shows a large plume that is bigger than it was, holding its intensity, actively pushing outward into the surrounding sea. In the language of someone whose job is reading these images, an expanding discoloration field means an eruption that is still being actively, vigorously fed from below. The volcano is not running low on energy. 2 weeks into this, it is still very much delivering everything it was delivering at the start and arguably more. There is a subtlety to reading discoloured water that is worth knowing, because it speaks to how careful this kind of monitoring has to be. Not every patch of off-colour ocean is a volcano. The sea changes colour for many reasons. Blooms of plankton can turn vast areas green or red. River outflows carry brown sediment far offshore. Storms stir up the shallows. So the people interpreting satellite imagery cannot simply see a stain and declare an eruption. They have to look at the whole picture. They look at the shape of the discoloration and whether it radiates from a single point. They look at whether it persists in the same place day after day, anchored rather than drifting with the currents the way a plankton bloom would. They cross-check it against the infrasound, against the seismic record, against the ash advisories. The conclusion that Titan Ridge is erupting is not built on the discoloured water alone. It is built on the discoloured water agreeing with the infrasound, and the infrasound agreeing with the earthquakes, and all three of them pointing at the same patch of seabed at the same time. That convergence, three independent lines of evidence telling the same story, is what makes the conclusion solid. It is also, incidentally, why this is real science and not guesswork, even though no one has ever seen the volcano. The third way of watching is the ground itself, or rather, the seafloor, because Titan Ridge has been shaking. From before the eruption ever even began, from before the infrasound sensors caught that 1:15 in the morning pulse, there were earthquakes. Not one single large earthquake, but a swarm of smaller ones, a tight, dense cluster of quakes all happening in the same patch of seabed over a short and concentrated span of time. We're going to come back to that swarm in serious detail later in this video, because what it has done since the eruption began is, without exaggeration, one of the most important and most genuinely unsettling parts of this entire story. But for right now, simply understand its role at the very start. The swarm was the first warning. It was the earliest signal that something powerful was moving down there, on the move, before anything at all had reached the surface. It is the third instrument in the toolkit, sound and colour and shaking, that together let us monitor a volcano none of us will ever see. Now hold all three of those things together in your mind at once, because here is the point that ties this entire section back to the question we are really chasing. The reason we can even stand here and seriously, soberly discuss whether a new island is being born in the Central Bismarck Sea is that these three indirect signals, the infrasound, the discoloured water, and the seismic swarm, let us read a volcano that we will never look at directly. Every single thing we know about Titan Ridge, we know second-hand. We know it by inference, from the fingerprints the volcano leaves behind, rather than from any direct sight of the thing itself. And that, in the very same breath, is also the reason that no one is talking about it. The eruption hides itself completely from cameras and reveals itself only to instruments. The silence and the discovery come from exactly the same underlying fact. The ocean that makes this event invisible to the watching world is the very same ocean that has forced scientists to become extraordinarily, almost beautifully good at watching the invisible. So understand this clearly. We are not flying blind out here. We are watching this eruption very closely indeed. We are simply watching it with instruments instead of with eyes, and what those instruments have recorded over the last 2 weeks is exactly what we need to talk about next. Part 3, 2 weeks we already watched. To truly understand why tonight matters, why the 22nd of May is a moment worth stopping for, you have to understand that this is the third separate time we have come back to this volcano, and each time we have returned, the story has escalated, it has stepped up. So let us walk the timeline carefully from the beginning, because the shape of that timeline, the direction it has been moving, is the entire point. Go back to the 8th of May. That is the day the eruption began, at that 1:15 in the morning onset that the infrasound sensors caught and recorded. When we first covered this volcano, the picture was already dramatic. It was already a serious event from its opening minutes. This was a submarine eruption beginning at significant depth, with the vent estimated to sit well over 1,000 meters below the surface of the sea. Think about what that means physically. That is a vertical column of water more than a kilometer tall, sitting directly on top of the vent, and the weight of that much water presses down with an almost unimaginable, crushing force. Pressures of well over 100 times the pressure of the atmosphere at sea level. And yet, even from beneath all of that, even fighting against that crushing hydrostatic weight, the eruption was powerful enough to push an ash-bearing column up out of the water entirely and into the open sky. A sustained plume reported at around 9,000 feet above the surface of the sea. Stop and consider the full vertical scale of that. To get volcanic ash from the floor of the deep ocean up through more than a kilometer of crushing water and then thousands of feet further up into the open atmosphere takes a genuinely, seriously energetic eruption. This was never a quiet little leak on the seabed. From the very first day, from the very first hours, this was a major event. Consider for a moment the sheer physical effort involved in that opening act, because it tells you something about the power of the system we're dealing with. The water pressure at the depth of the vent is crushing. Well over 100 times the pressure you and I feel standing in the open air. Every cubic meter of magma and gas and ash that the eruption pushed upward had to fight against that pressure the entire way. And it did not just fight to the seafloor. It fought all the way up through more than a kilometre of dense, cold, resisting seawater, and then it kept going, breaking through the surface and continuing thousands of feet up into the open sky. That is an enormous expenditure of energy, sustained from the very first hours. A volcano that can do that on its opening day is not a marginal, struggling system. It is a system with real power behind it, real pressure, real magma supply, and everything that has happened in the 2 weeks since has only confirmed that first impression. And the eruption did not arrive alone. It arrived in the company of an earthquake, a moderate but very distinct shock that carried the seismic signature of magma forcing its way upward through the crust. That is a specific and recognizable kind of earthquake. It is not the grinding of two plates against each other. It is the fracturing of solid rock by the pressure of molten rock pushing through it, and it tends to mark the precise moment that a volcanic system commits itself to erupting. That earthquake and the cluster of smaller ones gathered around it was the opening note of a seismic story that we're going to return to in depth. On the 8th of May, all of this was brand new, and all of it, even on day one, was already more than enough to make Titan Ridge a volcano worth watching very closely. Then go forward exactly 1 week, to the 15th of May. That is when we came back to this volcano the second time, and the reason we came back is that the volcano had been struck, while it was still actively erupting, by a powerful earthquake, a magnitude 5.4 hitting the same active submarine system right in the middle of its ongoing eruption. And by that point, 1 week in, the imagery had changed significantly. The discoloured water patch had grown to something on the order of 9 kilometres by 11 kilometres across, an enormous sprawling bruise on the surface of the sea, a discoloration field you could comfortably fit a major city inside. The plume was still rising thousands of metres into the air. Ash was being carried away downwind at altitude, drifting across the sea, and there was one new detail in the reports, a small one, easy to overlook, that turned out to matter far, far more than its modest size suggested. Pumice had started to appear on the surface of the water. That detail is, genuinely, the hinge of this entire story, so let me slow down and make absolutely sure it lands properly. In the first days of the eruption, what was reaching the surface of the sea was mostly steam and gas. Steam and gas on their own tell you a specific thing. They tell you that hot rock is meeting cold seawater. They are the signature of water being violently flashed into vapour by direct contact with magma and superheated stone. That is dramatic, certainly, but it is, in an important sense, the ocean's reaction to the volcano. It is the sea recoiling from the heat. Pumice is something fundamentally different. Pumice is the volcano's own material. It is rock that was, only moments earlier, molten magma deep in the system. And the appearance of pumice at the surface tells you that the magma itself is now fragmenting, that it is breaking apart violently, shattering into pieces as it rises and the pressure around it drops away. The shift from a steam and gas eruption to an eruption that is throwing up its own shattered, fragmented rock is a genuine escalation in the fundamental character of the event. When we covered this volcano on the 15th of May, that escalation had only just begun. The system had stopped merely boiling the sea around it, and had started instead to tear itself apart and float the pieces. Before we get to tonight, it is worth dwelling on that word sustained, because in volcanology it is one of the most meaningful words there is. Most volcanic events are not sustained. They are brief. A volcano produces an explosion, or a short burst of activity, lasting minutes, or hours, or a day, and then it falls quiet again, sometimes for years, sometimes for centuries. The brief punctuated eruption is the normal rhythm of most of the world's volcanoes. A sustained eruption, one that simply does not stop, one that keeps delivering material continuously day after day after day, is a different and more serious animal. It tells you that the plumbing of the volcano, the pathway from the magma source deep below up to the vent, has opened cleanly and stayed open. It tells you that the supply of magma feeding the eruption is large and steady and not easily exhausted. A volcano that erupts for an hour might be running on a small isolated pocket of magma that quickly empties. A volcano that erupts continuously for 2 weeks is tapping something far more substantial, and is doing so through a conduit that the eruption itself is keeping open and clear. That is why the duration of the Titan Ridge eruption is not just a number. It is a measure of how serious and how well supplied this system actually is. 2 weeks of continuous eruption is the system telling us that it has plenty more where this came from, which brings us, at last, to tonight, the 22nd of May. 2 weeks and 1 day after the whole thing began, and the headline of tonight is almost stark in its simplicity. It is still going. It did not stop. After 14 straight continuous days, the plumes are still rising off the eruption site. The discoloured water is not merely still present, it is, as we have now seen clearly in the satellite imagery, still actively expanding, still pushing outward. The pumice is no longer a one-time curiosity, a strange detail in a single report. It is rafting now, collecting, gathering itself into those drifting patches and long ribbons of floating stone we described at the very start. Every single indicator that told us 2 weeks ago that this was a serious, sustained, escalating eruption is not just still present today. It has intensified, and that distinction matters enormously. A volcano that erupts for an afternoon, or for a day, is an event. It happens, and then it is over, and you study it afterward. A volcano that erupts continuously for more than 2 weeks, and is still building, still expanding, with no clear end in sight, is something else entirely. It is not an event, it is a process. And processes, unlike events, have something that events do not have. They have time. They have time to make something. An afternoon is enough to leave a scar. 2 weeks and counting is enough to leave a monument, or a mountain, or an island, or a hazard. The difference between an event and a process is the difference between something that happens to the world and something that changes it. It is in exactly this context, a sustained 2-week still escalating process, that a genuinely striking claim has entered the conversation around Titan Ridge. People who have been tracking this eruption closely, observers watching the satellite feeds and the data the same way we have been, have begun describing it as the largest volcanic eruption of 2026 so far, the biggest of the year, and alongside that claim has come an estimate of how long it might continue. A range, and a strikingly, almost startlingly wide one. It runs from a few more days, at the low end, to a few more years at the high end. I want to handle that claim with real honesty, the way we try to handle every claim on this channel, because how you weigh a claim like this matters. The phrase largest eruption of the year is not a precise, peer-reviewed, certified measurement. It is an assessment, an informed impression made by people watching the same indirect signals we have spent this video describing, and it necessarily carries all the uncertainty that comes with that. This eruption is remote. It is underwater. A formal, rigorous ranking of its true size against every other volcanic eruption on Earth this year is simply not something that anyone can hand you right now, with a clean, defensible number attached to it. So treat the phrase largest eruption of the year as exactly what it is, an informed impression from close and serious observers that this is a big one, quite possibly the biggest of the year, rather than as a settled and stamped scientific fact. But, and this is just as important, do not wave the claim away either. The people saying it are not looking at nothing. They are looking at a discoloration field the size of a small country. They are looking at a plume that has not quit in 2 solid weeks. They are looking at rafts of fresh volcanic rock spreading steadily across the open sea. That impression of scale did not come from nowhere. It came from real and substantial observations, and the duration estimate, that strange, wide, days to years range, is, in its own quiet way, the single most revealing part of the whole thing. Because it is not a hedge. It is not someone dodging the question. It is an honest, direct admission that a sustained submarine eruption like this one genuinely can stop next week, and equally genuinely can still be erupting long after this video has been forgotten. The people closest to this data are telling you, in plain and unguarded terms, that they do not know how long it will run, and that uncertainty is not a weakness in this story. It is not a gap to be apologized for. That uncertainty is the story. Because if this eruption stops in a few days, it will likely subside into history as a strange, half-noticed event, a stain that faded, a curiosity for specialists. But if it runs for months, or for longer still, with a vent positioned where this particular vent appears to be positioned, then it has the one thing it needs to do the thing we keep circling back toward. It has time. It has time to build. And the clearest, most physical clue we currently have about whether it is in fact building something, building toward land, is the rock that is floating on the surface of the sea right now. So let us go and look closely at that rock, because the floating rock is trying to tell us something very specific, and once you understand it, you cannot ununderstand it. Part 4. The Floating Rock. There is something that feels almost wrong, almost like a violation of common sense, about the very idea of rock that floats. Rock is the thing we reach for as our metaphor for sinking. We say something went down like a stone. We say it sank like a rock. Stone going down is so fundamental to our intuition that we built our language around it. And yet, drifting across the surface of the Central Bismarck Sea right now, this very night, are rafts of genuine, solid, volcanic rock, riding on top of the ocean. To understand what that floating rock means for Titan Ridge, and it means a great deal, you first have to understand why it floats at all. Because the reason it floats is itself a clue, and a powerful one. The rock is pumice. And pumice forms under a very specific set of circumstances. It forms when magma that is absolutely saturated with dissolved gas erupts, and then decompresses extremely fast. To understand why, you have to understand a little about how gas behaves inside magma, because it is the gas that does all the work. Deep inside a volcanic system, magma sits under tremendous pressure, and at high pressure, gas dissolves readily into the molten rock. Water vapor, carbon dioxide, sulfur compounds, all of it dissolves into the magma and stays there, invisibly, as long as the pressure remains high. The magma may be carrying an enormous quantity of dissolved gas and show no outward sign of it at all. It is loaded, but it is calm because the pressure is keeping the gas in solution. Now, what happens when that magma begins to rise? As it climbs toward the surface, the pressure on it steadily drops. And as the pressure drops, the magma can no longer hold all that gas in solution. The gas begins to come out, forming bubbles. If the magma rises slowly, the bubbles have time to form gently, grow, and escape in an orderly way, and you get a relatively calm eruption. But if the magma rises fast, if the pressure drops suddenly, the gas comes out of solution all at once, explosively, and the magma is blown apart from the inside by its own escaping gas. That is fragmentation. That is the violent kind of eruption, and that is the kind of eruption that makes pumice. Let me give you the analogy that makes this click, because once it clicks, the rest of the story follows naturally. Picture the magma, deep down inside the volcanic system, as a sealed bottle of soda that has been violently shaken. While the bottle is still sealed, while the pressure inside it remains high, all of that gas stays dissolved, held invisibly in the liquid, in solution. You cannot see it. It is there, but it is hidden, locked in by the pressure. Now picture the cap coming off. The instant the pressure is released, the gas comes screaming out of solution all at once, erupting into a violent froth of bubbles. Now take that exact process and instead of soda, apply it to molten rock, apply it to magma. The magma rises, the pressure on it drops away rapidly, and the dissolved gas inside it comes blasting out of solution as countless expanding bubbles. And here is the crucial final step. Imagine that this all happens so fast that the rock freezes solid, chills from molten to rigid, while the bubbles are still mid-escape, still frozen in the act of expanding. That frozen froth is pumice. It is volcanic glass that has been whipped into a foam and then flash frozen in place. It is a solid that is riddled all the way through, with so many tiny sealed gas pockets that the overall structure of the material, even though the material itself is genuinely stone, is, on average, lighter than water, and so it floats. Pumice floats because pumice is mostly holes, and every single one of those holes is a tiny fossil, a permanent record of a violent, gas-rich, fast-moving eruption. When all of that happens underwater and when it happens on a large enough scale, the pumice does not simply bob around quietly near the vent. It accumulates. The countless individual fragments of frozen froth rise up through the water column, reach the surface, and then get herded together by the wind and the ocean currents into floating masses. We call those masses pumice rafts, and these rafts can be genuinely, almost unbelievably vast. In past eruptions elsewhere across the Pacific, submarine volcanoes have produced pumice rafts that are measured not in meters, but in tens, and in some cases hundreds, of square kilometres, rafts large enough that satellites tracked them for months on end as they drifted slowly across the open ocean, rafts large enough that ships were formally advised to alter course and steer around them, rafts large enough that they eventually carried their cargo of volcanic rock all the way to distant beaches, thousands of kilometres from the volcano that originally made it, depositing fresh stone on shorelines a world away. A pumice raft is one of the very few ways that a hidden submarine eruption can physically reach out across the ocean and touch the wider world. It is worth pausing here to appreciate just how strange and how useful a substance pumice really is, because it is one of those rare materials whose very existence carries information. Most rock tells you almost nothing about how it formed just by floating or sinking, but pumice does. Pumice is, in a sense, a frozen photograph of a single violent instant. Every one of those millions of tiny sealed bubbles inside a fragment of pumice was a pocket of gas that was, at the moment of eruption, trying desperately to escape. The fact that the bubbles are still there, still sealed, still trapped, tells you that the rock cooled and solidified faster than the gas could finish getting out. That is a specific and demanding condition. It means rapid cooling. It means violent decompression. It means the magma went from molten to solid in a window of time short enough to catch the gas mid-flight. Slow cooling lava does not do this. It gives the gas all the time it needs to escape, and you end up with dense, solid rock. Pumice is the signature of speed, and of violence, and of gas, and the ocean is producing it here in such quantity that it is gathering into rafts large enough to see from orbit. There is also a deeper history written into those rafts, one that connects this single eruption to the long story of life on this planet. Pumice rafts are, as it turns out, one of the great natural distribution systems of the ocean. Because they float, and because they drift for months, they become travelling platforms. Marine organisms, barnacles, algae, small creatures, colonise the floating rock as it crosses the sea, and the rafts carry those organisms enormous distances, depositing them on faraway shores. Some scientists believe that pumice rafts from past Pacific eruptions have played a genuine role in helping to repopulate damaged coral reefs, ferrying new life across stretches of ocean that organisms could never have crossed on their own. So the rafts drifting away from Titan Ridge tonight are not merely debris and not merely evidence. They are, in a small way, part of a process older than humanity. The ocean using the violence of its volcanoes to move life around. That is not central to our story tonight, but it is worth knowing, because it tells you that what is happening at Titan Ridge is not an isolated curiosity. It is one instance of something the Pacific has been doing for a very, very long time. So the fact that Titan Ridge is producing pumice rafts is not a minor or a decorative detail. It is not a footnote. It tells us something concrete about the eruption, and it tells it to us with real force. It tells us first of all that this eruption is vigorous. This matters, so let me be precise about it. A quiet submarine eruption, the gentle kind, where magma simply oozes slowly out onto the seafloor and cools peacefully under the great weight of all that water, does not produce great quantities of frothy, fragmented, floating rock. It produces solid, dense lava that stays exactly where it is, down on the bottom. To get pumice at all, and especially to get enough pumice to form drifting rafts of it, you need the violent version of a submarine eruption. You need magma that is actively fragmenting, shattering itself, tearing itself apart into glassy froth as it erupts. So the rafts are direct physical proof that what is happening at Titan Ridge is the energetic, violent kind of submarine eruption, and not the gentle, quiet kind. That alone is significant. But the pumice tells us something second as well. And the second thing points directly, like a compass needle, at the question this whole video is built around. For magma to fragment in that violent way, the dissolved gas inside it has to be able to come out of solution explosively. An explosive decompression like that is far, far easier to achieve when the drop in pressure is large and fast, which in turn is far easier to achieve when the eruption is happening closer to the surface of the sea. Closer to the surface means less water weighing down on the vent. Less water weight means less pressure holding the gas in. Deep, high-pressure water actively suppresses fragmentation. It keeps the cap firmly on the soda bottle. It holds the gas dissolved and quiet. Shallow water, by contrast, lets the bottle open. So abundant pumice is itself a sign, not a proof, but a genuine and meaningful sign, that at the level where the rock is fragmenting, this system is not being fully suppressed and smothered by the crushing weight of the ocean. The fragmentation is winning. The gas is getting out. Now sit with what that combination actually implies, because it is the heart of this section. The presence of all this floating rock on the Bismarck Sea is telling us, at the same time, two things. It is telling us that the eruption is vigorous, energetic, violent, and it is telling us that it is fragmenting magma in a way that points toward a relatively shallow, relatively energetic process near the top of the system. And a vigorous, fragmenting, relatively shallow submarine eruption, one that crucially goes on and on and on, sustained for weeks, is exactly, precisely the specific kind of eruption that builds new land. The pumice drifting across the surface of the Central Bismarck Sea is not just debris. It is not just wreckage. It is a status report transmitted to us from a volcano we cannot see, and the report reads, in effect, I am erupting hard. I am erupting in a way that the ocean is not managing to smother, and I am producing solid material, fresh rock, in enormous quantity. The only thing the pumice cannot tell us, on its own, is whether all of that solid material is piling up in a place high enough, shallow enough, to ever actually break the surface of the sea and become an island. And that question, the final question, comes down to a single number, one number, a number that, as we are about to see, almost nobody on Earth actually has. Part 5. The number nobody has. Every dramatic possibility in this entire story, the birth of a new island, the escalating hazard, all of it, every branch of the path, funnels down in the end to one single, unglamorous, deeply technical quantity, the depth of the vent. How far below the surface of the sea is the actual mouth of this volcano? Where is the opening, the precise point from which the eruption is emerging? That one number, more than almost anything else we could measure, decides what Titan Ridge is fundamentally capable of, and the genuinely uncomfortable truth, sitting right at the centre of this whole story, is that nobody has measured it well. The science of mapping the shape and the depth of the seafloor has a name. It is called bathymetry. Bathymetry is, in essence, topography for the bottom of the ocean. It is a map, not of the mountains and valleys and plains of the dry land, but of the ridges and trenches and abyssal plains that exist down beneath the water. And here is a fact about bathymetry that genuinely surprises most people when they first hear it, and that is worth pausing on. We have mapped the surface of the Moon and the surface of the planet Mars in far greater and more complete detail than we have mapped the floor of our own ocean. The deep sea remains the great unmapped frontier of our own planet, a vast, dark territory right here on Earth that we know less about, in fine detail, than we know about other worlds. And the Central Bismarck Sea, this remote stretch of water north of New Guinea, with no cities, little shipping traffic, and almost no reason for anyone to have ever surveyed it thoroughly, is one of the more poorly mapped corners of that already poorly mapped frontier. The bathymetry data for the exact patch of seabed where Titan Ridge sits and erupts is, to put it in plain and direct terms, low quality. It is sparse. It is, in places, old. It is not the kind of precise, modern, high-resolution map that would allow someone to point confidently at the vent and tell you its depth to the meter, or even close to it. It is worth understanding why the deep sea is so hard to map, because it is not for lack of trying. The problem is fundamental, and it is about light. From space, we can map the surface of a planet with cameras, because light travels freely through the vacuum and the thin air, and a camera can simply see the ground. Seawater does not allow that. Light penetrates only a short way into the ocean before it is absorbed completely, and below that shallow, sunlit layer, the deep sea is in total, permanent darkness. You cannot photograph the seafloor from above, so mapping the deep ocean has to be done with sound, with sonar, with ships dragging acoustic instruments slowly back and forth, pinging the bottom and timing the echoes, and that is painstaking, expensive, slow work. A single ship moving at survey speed maps only a narrow ribbon of seabed beneath it as it goes. To map an entire ocean that way takes a vast amount of ship time, and the world has only ever devoted a fraction of the necessary effort to it. The result is that enormous areas of the deep sea have never been properly surveyed at all. They appear on our maps only as crude, low-resolution estimates, filled in by satellite gravity measurements that can sense the broad shape of the seafloor, but cannot resolve the fine detail. The Central Bismarck Sea, remote and rarely travelled, is one of those gap regions. We are, in a real sense, looking at Titan Ridge through a blurred and incomplete map, so we are working with poor data here. But poor data is not the same thing as no data at all, and what the limited information we do have actually suggests is the precise detail that makes this entire story urgent rather than merely interesting. Based on what bathymetry does exist for this area, the eruptive vent at Titan Ridge appears to be fairly close to the surface of the sea. Not confirmed, not measured precisely, not certain. But the available evidence, such as it is, points toward a vent that is shallow rather than deep, and that single, uncertain, poorly constrained word, shallow, is the hinge on which the entire future of this story turns. Here is why that one word matters so enormously. Let me walk you carefully through the mechanism of how a volcano actually builds an island, step by step, because once you can see that mechanism clearly in your mind, the stakes of that depth number become completely obvious. A submarine volcano erupts. As it erupts, it produces solid material. Lava, ash, fragmented rock, pumice, all of it. That solid material does not simply vanish into the sea. It falls back down, settling around the vent, and it accumulates. It piles up. Erupt just once, briefly, and you get a modest little pile of debris. But erupt continuously, for weeks, for months, for longer, and that pile grows. It grows into a genuine cone, a true volcanic mountain, rising up off the floor of the ocean. Now, here is the fork in the road, and it is governed entirely by the depth of the vent. If the vent is extremely deep, say several kilometers down, then that cone can grow and grow and grow for a very long time, and still never come anywhere close to the surface. It simply becomes a taller and taller underwater mountain. We have a name for that. We call it a seamount. The ocean stays closed and unbroken over the top of it, and the world never sees it. But if the vent is shallow, and the eruption is sustained, then the situation is entirely different. The cone has only a short distance to climb. It builds upward, and at some point, if the eruption lasts long enough, the growing pile of fresh volcanic rock reaches the surface of the sea, and it breaches. It breaks through into the open air. It becomes dry land. It becomes an island that, only a month or two earlier, simply did not exist anywhere on Earth. Now, look at Titan Ridge against that mechanism. Look at it directly, and hold up against it the two specific things we have already firmly established in this video. First, we have a vent that, on the limited and poor quality data available, appears to be relatively shallow. Second, we have an eruption that has been sustained, continuously, without a break, for more than 2 weeks, and that is still going strong tonight, with no clear sign of stopping. Those are the two essential ingredients for island birth. A shallow vent gives the growing cone a short climb to make. A sustained eruption gives that cone both the time and the raw material it needs to actually make the climb. And when both of those conditions are true at the same time, the birth of a brand new island stops being a wild or a fanciful idea and becomes a genuine, live, physically reasonable possibility. I want to be clear that this is not hype. This is not me reaching for drama. This is simply the established mechanism of how islands form, applied honestly and directly to the situation that is actually in front of us right now. But I have to be just as honest and just as forceful about the other side of it, because real intellectual honesty is the entire point of doing this properly, and it is what this channel is supposed to be for. The data is poor. That one word, shallow, is doing an absolutely enormous amount of load-bearing work in this story, and it is resting its entire weight on bathymetry that nobody, anywhere, would describe as reliable. It is entirely possible, and I mean genuinely possible, not as a token caveat thrown in for balance, but as a real and live alternative, that better mapping of this seabed would reveal the vent to be considerably deeper than the current data suggests. Deep enough that the cone, however long this eruption ultimately runs, never reaches the surface. Deep enough that Titan Ridge simply becomes a new underwater mountain, a fresh seamount that the world never sees and never names and never adds to any map. That outcome is fully, completely consistent with everything we actually know for certain. Nobody can rule it out, because the one single measurement that would settle the question once and for all is the exact measurement that we do not have. It is worth dwelling for a moment on just how common the hidden mountain outcome actually is, because most people do not realize it. The floor of the Pacific Ocean is studded with tens of thousands of seamounts, underwater volcanic mountains, many of them genuinely enormous, that rise thousands of meters off the abyssal plain and yet never come within reach of the surface. They are, in every sense except the final one, mountains. Some of them are taller, from base to summit, than many of the famous peaks on dry land. And almost none of them have names because no one ever sees them, and they have never affected a single human life. They erupted, they built themselves up, they ran out of magma or never had a shallow enough vent to begin with, and they simply stopped. Finished mountains, complete and invisible, scattered across the dark floor of the sea in their tens of thousands. That is the quiet, undramatic, statistically most common fate of a submarine volcano. It builds a mountain that the world never knows about. And it is entirely possible that this is the fate of Titan Ridge, that in a year, or 10 years, the only thing that will have changed is that the poorly mapped seabed of the Central Bismarck Sea will hold one more unnamed underwater peak, and no one but a handful of specialists will ever know it is there. The island outcome is the rare and dramatic one, the seamount outcome is the ordinary one, and with the data we have, we genuinely cannot say which of those two outcomes we are watching. So this is where we genuinely, honestly stand on the 22nd of May, 2026. We are watching a volcano that may be building an island, and we cannot tell you whether it is, and it is important to understand why we cannot tell you. It is not because we are not looking. It is not because we are not paying attention. And it is not because the information is being hidden or kept from us. It is simply because the one specific piece of data that is required to answer the question, a precise depth for that vent, has never been collected for this remote and forgotten patch of seabed. We are watching a process unfold in real time, whose ultimate outcome is, right now, tonight, honestly and genuinely undetermined. It might be assembling a new piece of the map of the world. It might be quietly building a mountain that will stay hidden beneath the waves forever. The pumice tells us clearly that it is producing the raw material in quantity. The 2-week duration tells us that it has the time, but the vent depth, the one number that would tell us whether all of that adds up to actual land breaking the surface, is the number that nobody has. And here is the twist that makes even the optimistic version of this story more complicated and more interesting than it first appears. Suppose, for a moment, that the vent really is shallow. Suppose the eruption runs long enough. Suppose that in the coming weeks, a dark speck of brand new rock actually does break the surface of the Central Bismarck Sea, and a new island is undeniably born. Even then, even in that dramatic, headline-grabbing island-is-born version of events, the story would still not be over, because a newborn volcanic island is one of the most fragile things that the entire planet ever makes, and the sea that surrounds a new island does not necessarily intend to let it stay. Part 6. Islands that vanish. We tend, almost without thinking about it, to imagine that once an island appears it is simply there, permanent, a finished thing, a new and lasting dot on the map, added for good. The actual history of the Pacific Ocean tells a very different and far more humbling story. This ocean has, more than once, produced a brand new volcanic island, and then turned around and taken it straight back, sometimes within a matter of mere weeks. The reason comes down, fundamentally, to what a young volcanic island is actually made of. An island built up by a sustained eruption of the fragmenting, pumice-producing kind, exactly the kind of eruption the evidence suggests is happening at Titan Ridge, is, at first, in its earliest days, essentially nothing more than a heap of loose volcanic debris. It is ash and fragmented rock and pumice and cinders, all piled up high enough into a cone that the very top of it has managed to poke up above the waterline. And the ocean, it must be said, is utterly relentless. The waves never rest. They do not pause. Day after day, swell after swell, storm after storm, the sea hammers ceaselessly at the edges of that loose, unconsolidated pile. And loose volcanic debris has very, very little ability to resist that kind of sustained assault. The waves carry the material away faster than you might intuitively think possible, eating into the new island, planing it down, stripping it back grain by grain and fragment by fragment, until the cone that fought its way up above the surface is simply gone again, returned to being nothing more than a shallow, submerged bank of sediment. The Pacific has done exactly this more than once. It has produced an island in a dramatic burst of eruption, and then quietly erased that island again before the year was even out. The map gained a feature, and then lost it, and most of the world never knew either had happened. There is something almost poignant about these vanished islands, and it is worth sitting with for a moment because it reframes how you think about what we might be watching. When a new volcanic island appears and is then erased, it does not simply disappear without a trace. For the weeks or months that it exists, it is a real place. It has a shape, it has a shoreline, birds can land on it, it casts a shadow. It is briefly a genuine piece of the world, and then the sea takes it back, and the only evidence it ever existed is a scattering of satellite images and, perhaps, a shallow bank of sediment where it used to stand. There have been cases in the Pacific and elsewhere where a new island was given a name, was noted on charts, was discussed, and then was gone before those discussions had even finished, leaving cartographers in the strange position of having to undraw something they had just drawn. The ocean is not sentimental about geography. A piece of land that took a volcano weeks of continuous effort to build can be undone by a single season of storms. And that impermanence is not a flaw in the process. It is simply the nature of building anything out of loose material in the path of an ocean. But, and this is the crucial qualification, the thing that keeps the outcome at Titan Ridge genuinely uncertain rather than simply doomed, that is not the only way the story can go. Some new volcanic islands survive. They persist. They become permanent. And the difference between an island that vanishes and an island that lasts comes down, more than to anything else, to a single factor: whether the eruption that built it produces enough durable lava. Durable lava means solid, coherent, tough rock, proper lava flows, rather than just loose, fragmented, easily scattered debris. If a sustained eruption can manage to lay down tougher lava flows that cap and cover and protect the loose interior of the new island, then that island gains a kind of armour. It gains a hard shell that the waves cannot easily strip away. And an armoured island can endure. It can stand against the sea. It can become a real, lasting, permanent piece of the world's geography. The Pacific has done this too. It has built islands this way that are still there today, that became genuine and durable additions to the map. There is a race embedded in all of this, and it is worth naming clearly because it is the real contest that will decide the outcome. It is a race between construction and destruction. On one side is the volcano, building, pumping fresh material up from below, piling it higher, working to raise its cone above the waves and then to armour it with durable lava. On the other side is the ocean, demolishing, every wave, every tide, every storm chipping away at whatever the volcano manages to build. While the eruption is vigorous and continuous, construction has the upper hand. The volcano can add material faster than the sea can take it away. But the moment the eruption weakens or stops, the race tips. The building halts, and the demolition does not. From that moment on, the only thing standing between a new island and oblivion is how much durable, wave-resistant rock the volcano managed to lay down before its time ran out. This is why the duration estimate we talked about earlier, that days to years range, matters so much for the island's survival, and not just for whether an island forms at all. A volcano that erupts for only a little longer may breach the surface, and then immediately lose the race. A volcano that erupts for months has time not just to build, but to fortify. So when you ask the question, what happens if Titan Ridge succeeds in building an island, the honest answer is that you are looking at a genuine fork in the road, with two very different destinations. Down one path that could be a brief flash of new land that the sea reclaims and erases within weeks. A piece of the planet that exists just barely long enough to be photographed once or twice from orbit, and is then gone, swallowed back. Down the other path it could be a durable, armoured new island that outlasts every single one of us, and our children, and their children. A permanent new name on the map. And which of those two paths Titan Ridge ultimately takes would depend entirely on the character of the eruption in the weeks and the months after any breach of the surface, on whether this volcano can manage to armour what it builds before the ocean tears it down. And this is what connects the fragile island question directly back to the very heart of this story, to the central thread we keep returning to. The satellite imagery from the 22nd of May is not a photograph of an ending. It is not a picture of a finished event. It is the opening frame of a process whose conclusion the sea itself has not yet decided. The real question, then, is not the simple one we started with. It is not just, is an island forming? The fuller, truer, more honest question is this: is an island forming? And if it is, will the ocean permit it to stay? We are not watching a completed event. We are watching the first act of something genuinely uncertain, and the next acts have not yet been written. Which means that the only way to know how this story actually ends is to keep watching it, closely, in the weeks ahead. And it also means we need to do one more thing before we go further. We need to understand the full range of what this volcano is capable of, including the most extreme and most frightening end of that range. So before we move on, we have to talk carefully about the ceiling. We have to talk about the worst that a shallow submarine eruption can do. Part 7. The ceiling, not the forecast. I am going to say one name in this section, and then I am going to spend the rest of the section being extremely careful about it, because the way you hold this name in your mind matters a great deal. The name is Hunga Tonga. In January of 2022, a submarine volcano in the Pacific island kingdom of Tonga produced one of the most violent volcanic events of the entire modern era. It was a submarine volcano with a relatively shallow vent. And when it erupted at its absolute peak, it did so with a force that is genuinely difficult to put into ordinary words. It blasted a towering column of ash and water vapour higher up into the atmosphere than any eruption ever recorded by modern scientific instruments. Its plume punched up through the stratosphere itself. It generated an atmospheric pressure wave so powerful that the wave travelled around the entire planet, not just once but multiple times, and was registered on barometers and sensitive instruments thousands upon thousands of miles away from Tonga. It triggered tsunami waves that spread across the whole Pacific basin. It was, by absolutely any measure you choose to apply, an extraordinary, world-altering and devastating event, and the reason it was so catastrophically violent connects directly, precisely, to the physics that we have already discussed earlier in this very video. And there is a grim irony hidden in the physics here, one worth making explicit. Everything that makes a shallow submarine eruption capable of building an island is the very same thing that makes it more dangerous. The shallowness that lets the cone reach the surface is the shallowness that reduces the suppressing weight of the water. The vigorous fragmentation that produces the pumice and the building material is the vigorous fragmentation that signals an energetic gas-rich system. The processes of creation and the processes of hazard are not opposites here. They are the same processes seen from two sides. A volcano cannot build an island gently. To make new land, it has to be the kind of volcano that is also, by its nature, capable of being dangerous. That is why this story refuses to resolve into a simple good news or bad news shape. The island and the hazard are braided together. You cannot root for one without acknowledging the other, because they are the same volcano doing the same thing. Remember what we established. When a submarine eruption happens in deep water, the immense pressure of the ocean above it actively suppresses the most explosive behaviour. It keeps the lid clamped on the soda bottle. It holds the violence in check. But when a submarine eruption happens in shallow water, where the vent is close to the surface, with relatively little water weight pressing down on it, then the eruption can interact with the sea in a far more dangerous and far more explosive way. Hot magma meeting cold seawater, with relatively little pressure available to restrain and contain the interaction, can produce a tremendously, explosively violent water magma reaction. It can produce a runaway feedback loop that drives the eruption to a level of violence that a deep, high-pressure eruption simply could never reach. Shallow is more energetic. Shallow is more explosive. Shallow is more dangerous. And Hunga Tonga stands as the stark, undeniable proof of just how far that shallow water violence can ultimately go. Now, here is where I have to be very careful indeed, and here is exactly why I have framed this entire section as a ceiling, and not as a forecast. I am not telling you that Titan Ridge is going to do what Hunga Tonga did. I am telling you, clearly and directly, the opposite of that. Across 2 full weeks of close observation, Titan Ridge has not behaved like a Hunga Tonga in the making. It has been a sustained, vigorous, escalating eruption, and that, as we have established at length, is serious enough entirely on its own terms, and deserves attention on its own terms. But it has not, across these 2 weeks, shown the specific signature of a volcano building toward that kind of singular, sudden, catastrophic, planet-ringing paroxysm. So Hunga Tonga does not appear in this section as a prediction of what is coming. It appears in this section as a boundary marker, as the edge of the map. The reason it is worth naming at all, the reason I've brought it up despite all these careful qualifications, is this. When we talk, as we have been, about the possibility of something worse, you the viewer genuinely deserve to know what the actual outer limit of worse looks like for this particular category of volcano. When a shallow submarine eruption goes wrong at the very far, extreme end of the scale of possibility, Hunga Tonga is what that extreme actually looks like in the real world. That is the ceiling. It defines the absolute top of the range of what is possible, so that the range we are discussing is honest and complete and not secretly hiding its worst case from you. But naming the ceiling of a room is not the same thing as standing directly underneath it. The overwhelming likelihood, based on everything that Titan Ridge has actually shown us across these 2 weeks of observation, is that this eruption lives nowhere near that ceiling. Hunga Tonga defines the edge of the map of possibility. It does not describe the place where we are currently standing. There is one more reason it is genuinely useful to have Hunga Tonga in mind, and it is not about fear. It is about humility. The Hunga Tonga eruption of 2022 surprised the scientists who study these systems. Its sheer violence, the height of its plume, the global reach of its pressure wave, much of that exceeded what the models had expected from a volcano of its type, and one of the lasting lessons of that event was a sharpened respect for how much we still do not know about shallow submarine eruptions specifically. They are, as a category, among the harder volcanic events to monitor and to forecast, precisely because they happen at the hidden boundary between rock, water and air, where the physics is complicated and the instruments are sparse. So when I tell you that Titan Ridge has not, across 2 weeks, behaved like a Hunga Tonga in the making, I want you to hear that statement with the appropriate humility built into it. It is an honest reading of the evidence we have. It is not a guarantee, because shallow submarine volcanoes have surprised us before. The responsible position is not to predict catastrophe, and it is not to promise safety. The responsible position is to watch closely, to keep the ceiling of possibility honestly in view, and to let the data, as it always must, have the final word. So hold Hunga Tonga in your mind only as exactly that, as the distant edge of the map. The full range of what a shallow submarine eruption can be is genuinely enormous. It runs all the way from a quiet pile of rock that never even manages to break the surface of the sea, up through the modest and wondrous birth of a new island, and then onward at the very far, rare, extreme end of the scale, up to something like what the Kingdom of Tonga endured in 2022. Titan Ridge is somewhere on that long range, and the evidence we actually have, the sustained but not paroxysmal behaviour, the vigorous but not catastrophic plumes, places it most likely in the broad middle of that range. A real, large, sustained, serious eruption, possibly building an island. Not, on the evidence, building a catastrophe. And now, with that full range honestly laid out in front of you, from the quiet floor of it all the way up to the violent ceiling, we can return to the single best tool we have for telling which way Titan Ridge is actually trending right now. Not the discoloration, not the pumice, the shaking. Because down beneath this eruption, the earthquakes have been doing something that earthquakes are simply not supposed to do. Part 8. The swarm that climbs the wrong way. Everything we have talked about so far in this video, the discoloured water spreading across the sea, the rafts of pumice, the open question of the vent's depth, all of that describes the eruption as it appears from above it and from around it. But there is one more stream of data still to examine, and this one comes from below. It comes from inside the system itself. It is the seismic record, the earthquakes. And the earthquakes beneath Titan Ridge have been behaving in a way that genuinely, urgently deserves your full attention, because they have been doing the precise opposite of what earthquakes are normally supposed to do. Let us start with the basic facts. From before the eruption even properly began, this volcano has been generating an earthquake swarm. Now, a swarm is a specific and well-defined thing in the science of seismology. It is not just a vague word for a lot of earthquakes. A swarm is a cluster of many earthquakes, grouped tightly together in both space and time, but, and this is the defining feature, without one single dominant main shock that towers over all the others in size. That is what makes a swarm different from the pattern most people are familiar with. The familiar pattern is one large earthquake, the main shock, followed by a long trailing sequence of smaller aftershocks. A swarm is not that. A swarm is more like a sustained flurry, a prolonged crackle of seismic activity, many events of broadly comparable size, going on. And around volcanoes specifically, earthquake swarms have a very well understood cause. They are quite simply the sound of magma on the move. As a body of molten rock forces and shoulders its way upward through the solid crust of the earth, it fractures and cracks and breaks the rock all around it. And every single one of those fractures, every one of those breaks is a small earthquake. A volcanic earthquake swarm is, in effect, the seismic signature, the sound, written in the ground, of magma pushing its way toward the surface. So the existence of a swarm beneath Titan Ridge is not in itself a surprise at all. It is entirely expected. It is the system doing exactly, precisely, what an erupting volcano is supposed to do. What is not expected, what is genuinely the strange and the important and the unsettling part of all this, is what the swarm has done over time. And to understand why it is so strange, you first need to understand a principle called Omori's Law. Omori's Law is one of the oldest, most established, and most reliable rules in the entire science of seismology. It has been understood for well over a century, and it describes with great consistency how a normal earthquake sequence behaves in the time after a main shock. It says, in plain and simple terms, that aftershocks decay. After the main event, the aftershocks come thick and fast at first, and then they come less and less often as time passes, growing steadily more spread out. And they also tend on the whole to get smaller. The sequence winds down, it fades away. A normal aftershock sequence, the kind Omori's Law describes, is the seismic picture of a system relaxing, a system releasing the last of its built-up stress in a slowly diminishing trail of smaller and smaller shocks. If you were to draw it on a chart, the line would trend downward, sloping toward quiet. That is what earthquake sequences are supposed to do. Left to themselves, they calm down, they settle. The sequence beneath Titan Ridge has not calmed down. It has not settled. It has done the exact reverse. And let me give you the actual progression of it, the real numbers, because the numbers themselves tell this story far better than any description of them could. When the eruption first began, back on the 8th of May, the earthquakes making up the swarm were in the magnitude 4 range. We are talking about events around magnitude 4.6, magnitude 4.7, magnitude 4.9. Those are significant earthquakes, genuinely substantial, but they are moderate. Then, on the 9th of May, just one day later, the swarm produced a magnitude 5.0. With that, the sequence crossed up and over into the magnitude 5 range. After that came a magnitude 5.2. Then, on the 15th of May, the very day we last came back to cover this volcano, there was a magnitude 5.4. And now, today, on the 22nd of May, the region around this volcano has been struck by a magnitude 5.7. I want you to look at that sequence laid out end to end, in order. 4.6, 4.7, 4.9, 5.0, 5.2, 5.4, 5.7. Now, that is not a sequence that is decaying. That is not Omori's Law. That is not a system winding down. That is unmistakably a sequence that is climbing. Over the course of 2 full weeks, the largest earthquakes in this swarm have not been getting smaller and less frequent. The way Omori's Law says a relaxing, settling system absolutely should. They have been getting bigger. The magnitude of the strongest events in the sequence has marched steadily and consistently upward, and a seismic sequence that climbs, instead of decaying, is telling you something very specific, and something genuinely important. It is telling you that this is very probably not a system relaxing in the aftermath of a single rupture. It is telling you instead that what you are looking at has the signature of a system that is still actively pressurizing. A system where the stress is still building, still accumulating, still being added to, and being added to faster than the earthquakes are managing to release it. Now let me be very precise about today's specific event, the magnitude 5.7, before I carry this any further, because precision genuinely matters here, and I do not want to overstate anything. The magnitude 5.7 earthquake on the 22nd of May appears in the Global Earthquake Catalogue at a location described as roughly 103 kilometers south-southeast of the town of Lorengau in Papua New Guinea at a shallow depth of about 10 kilometers below the surface. Lorengau, as we noted right at the start of this video, is the nearest named town to the Titan Ridge eruption site, so what we have, stated carefully and accurately, is an earthquake in the region around the erupting volcano. I am wording that very deliberately, and I want you to notice that I am. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that the catalogue has confirmed this earthquake's epicenter sitting exactly, precisely on top of the volcanic vent itself, because that would be a more exact and more confident claim than the available data cleanly and honestly supports. What I can tell you, and what genuinely matters for this story, is this. A magnitude 5.7 earthquake has struck the region around this actively erupting submarine volcano. It is the largest single event yet in a seismic sequence that has been climbing steadily for 2 full weeks, and it fits the escalating pattern of that sequence exactly, perfectly, like the next number in an obvious progression. Now, I want to be careful and fair here, because a responsible reading of a climbing swarm has to acknowledge what it does not prove, as well as what it suggests. A climbing magnitude sequence is a genuine signal, and it is the right thing to be watching, but a single climbing sequence, on its own, is not a crystal ball. Volcanic systems are complex, and seismic swarms do not always lead where their trend seems to point. A swarm can climb for a stretch and then, without obvious warning, simply level off and fade. The escalation can be a phase rather than a trajectory. So when I tell you that the climbing swarm beneath Titan Ridge points toward a system that is still pressurizing, I want you to hear the full honesty of that statement. It points that way. It leans that way. It is the most reasonable reading of the trend in front of us. But it is not a guarantee of what comes next, and anyone who tells you a swarm like this guarantees a larger event is overselling what the science can actually deliver. The correct posture is the one we keep returning to. This is a signal worth taking seriously, worth watching closely, and worth being honest about, in both directions. It could continue to climb, it could also stop. The swarm itself, as it unfolds in the days ahead, is what will tell us which. So, why does an escalating swarm raise the stakes of this story? Why does a climbing line of magnitudes matter so much? It raises the stakes because of a particular hazard that we now have to discuss, and discuss honestly. And the hazard is not in fact the eruption itself. The hazard is what a strong enough earthquake could potentially do to the unstable structure that the eruption is actively building down there. Think carefully about what is being assembled on that seafloor right now. A submarine volcano in the middle of a sustained vigorous eruption is piling up fresh, loose, fragmented volcanic material, ash, rock, pumice, debris on the floor of the sea. And steep growing piles of loose, unconsolidated material are, by their very nature, unstable. They are not solid, coherent rock. They can fail, they can slip, they can collapse, and when a large mass of material resting on a submarine slope suddenly gives way and slides downhill, a submarine landslide, it displaces a tremendous volume of seawater, and it displaces it all at once, in a single, violent moment. And displacing a large volume of water suddenly is, fundamentally, precisely how you generate a tsunami. Now, this is not the tsunami mechanism that most people picture in their minds. It is not the familiar one, where the seafloor itself lurches and jolts upward in a great megathrust earthquake. This is the flank collapse and submarine landslide mechanism. It is a tsunami born not directly from the shaking of the quake, but from a landslide that an earthquake, or the eruption's own growing instability, sets loose. It is worth understanding why a landslide-generated tsunami can be so dangerous, because it behaves differently from the kind most people have heard about. The familiar tsunami, the kind that devastated coastlines in the great disasters of recent memory, is generated by a megathrust earthquake. The seafloor over a huge area lurches vertically. The whole column of water above it is lifted or dropped, and a wave radiates outward across an entire ocean. Those waves are catastrophic, but they are also, in a sense, predictable in their physics, and warning systems are built around detecting the earthquake that causes them. A landslide-generated tsunami is different. It is often more localized. The wave can be enormous close to the source, and yet fade more quickly with distance. But close to the source, in the near field, a landslide tsunami can produce wave run-ups that are genuinely extreme, taller than what the same-sized earthquake would produce on its own, because a landslide can displace water with terrible suddenness and concentrated force. And critically, a landslide tsunami can arrive with very little warning. There may be no large, obvious earthquake to trigger an alert, or the triggering quake may be only moderate, the kind that does not by itself set off the warning systems. The wave can simply appear. That combination, potentially very large close to the source, and potentially arriving with little or no warning, is what makes the flank collapse and submarine landslide mechanism something that volcanologists take so seriously around unstable submarine volcanoes. This is exactly why we anchored our earlier coverage of this volcano to two specific historical events. And it is genuinely worth recalling them now, here, because they are the regional proof, the local documented evidence, that this mechanism is entirely real and that it is deadly. The first event is Ritter Island. Ritter Island lies in this very same Bismarck arc, this same volcanic region, and in the year 1888, the volcanic island of Ritter suffered a catastrophic flank collapse. An enormous portion of the volcano simply broke away and slid into the sea, and that collapse generated tsunami waves that ran up onto the surrounding coastlines with terrible force, sweeping across the region and killing people across a wide area. The second event is the Itape tsunami of 1998, which struck off the coast of Papua New Guinea. In that disaster, an earthquake triggered a submarine landslide, and that landslide generated a wave, and that wave killed thousands of people along the coast. Now here is the absolutely critical thing to understand about both of those disasters. Neither one of them required a record-breaking world historic enormous earthquake. Neither one needed a magnitude 9. What they required was a moderate trigger, acting on an unstable mass of underwater material. And that, a moderate trigger acting on an unstable underwater mass, is the precise combination that an escalating earthquake swarm, hammering away night and day right beside an actively erupting submarine volcano, brings squarely into the conversation. So let me now be very, very clear and very honest about where the hazard here actually sits, because I do not want to overstate this, and overstating it would be its own kind of failure, its own kind of dishonesty, and this channel does not do that. Today's magnitude 5.7, taken entirely by itself, is not a tsunami. It did not on its own generate a destructive wave. And a single isolated magnitude 5.7 earthquake is not, on its own, the thing to be afraid of here. The concern is not this specific earthquake. The concern is the trend that this earthquake belongs to. The concern is that the swarm is climbing, that the strongest events in it keep on getting stronger, week after week, and that if that climb continues, it steadily raises the odds of a genuinely larger earthquake occurring. And a genuinely larger earthquake striking an unstable, freshly built, loosely piled mass of volcanic material on a submarine slope is the exact combination that the documented history of this very region tells us can produce a deadly wave. So understand the distinction clearly. The 5.7 is not itself the danger. The 5.7 is the latest data point on a line, and that line is pointing the wrong way. And notice, this is important, notice how all of this ties directly back to the question at the centre of everything we've been discussing tonight. The exact same magma push that may be patiently building a brand new island down there, that vigorous, sustained upward drive of molten rock toward the surface, is also the very same thing that is fracturing the crust and driving this climbing earthquake swarm. The island building process and the hazard building process are not two separate, unrelated stories. They are one single volcano, one single upward push of magma, simply viewed from two different angles, measured by two different instruments. The pumice on the surface tells us that the volcano is building. The swarm beneath it tells us how hard the volcano is straining to do that building. And the swarm, that steadily climbing line of magnitudes, 4.6 up to 5.7, is our single best real-time readout of which way this whole thing is actually trending right now, tonight. And right now, that readout is not pointing toward a system that is settling down. It is pointing toward a system that is still under pressure, still loading, which means that the honest answer to the question we asked at the very start of this video, is this volcano relieving its stress, or is it building toward something worse, is that, as of tonight, the shaking is leaning toward the second answer, not confirming it. I want to be precise, not confirming it, but leaning toward it. And that, more than anything else, is precisely why this eruption deserves far, far more attention than it is currently getting. Part 9. Why no one is looking and why you should. So we arrive, at last, back exactly where we began, at the question that is stamped into the very title of this video. Something genuinely remarkable is happening in the Pacific Ocean right now. A sustained, escalating, quite possibly island-building submarine eruption. An eruption described by the close observers tracking it as potentially the largest of the entire year. An eruption with a steadily climbing earthquake swarm pulsing beneath it. And almost no one anywhere is talking about it. After everything we have now walked through together, that silence should genuinely strike you as strange. It should sit wrong. So let us answer it properly and completely, because the answer genuinely matters. The honest explanation is not dramatic, and I am not going to pretend to you that it is. There is no conspiracy here. The reason this story has stayed so quiet is a combination of three very ordinary, very mundane things. The first is the one we have come back to again and again throughout this video. There is no visible mountain. A submarine eruption produces no skyline. It produces no glowing crater for a camera. It produces no towering photogenic cone for a news broadcast to point at and build a segment around. What it produces is a discoloured patch of distant ocean and some floating rock, and that, simply put, is not the footage that leads a news broadcast. It does not compete. The second reason is location. This is one of the most genuinely remote stretches of ocean on the entire planet. It is far from cities, far from coastlines, far from the entire infrastructure of human attention. There is no town nearby filing reports. There are no tourists posting video clips to social media. There is no convenient vantage point, no road, no harbour. And the third reason is timing, and this is the one we have not yet fully unpacked, so let us do that now. This eruption did not happen during a quiet, empty month for the planet. It happened during an extraordinarily unusually busy stretch of global volcanic activity. Look at what else has been going on around the Pacific and beyond it during this very same window of time. There has been significant volcanic activity at Bazimiani, in the Russian Far East. Activity serious enough to have prompted an upgrade in the volcano's official alert status. The Kilauea volcano in Hawaii has continued its own long-running episodic eruption, drawing its own cameras and its own coverage. Mayon in the Philippines has remained active. Dukono in Indonesia has continued erupting, and there has been fresh, notable volcanic unrest at Bulusan, also in the Philippines. That is a genuinely crowded field of volcanic stories, and when that many volcanoes are active and generating their own headlines and their own footage all at the same time, an unphotogenic, hard-to-reach, camera-resistant submarine eruption, however large it may actually be, simply gets crowded out of the conversation entirely. It becomes one quiet signal lost in a very, very noisy month. Now, I want to take that crowded picture seriously for a moment, because it leads directly to a tempting alternative idea, and tempting ideas always deserve to be examined openly and fairly, rather than just dismissed out of hand. Some people, looking at that long list of volcanoes all active at the same time, will naturally ask whether it means something, whether the Pacific itself is somehow waking up all at once, whether the Great Ring of Fire is becoming in some way coordinated, all of these volcanoes stirring together as if connected by some single hidden trigger, some shared underground cause. It is a completely understandable thought. It is how the human mind works. When we see a cluster of things happening together, our minds instinctively reach for a single, unifying cause to explain them. But here is what the actual science says about this, and it is genuinely worth stating plainly and clearly. The Ring of Fire is, at any given moment in time, host to a large number of active volcanoes. That is simply its baseline state. That is normal. It is completely, entirely normal for many volcanoes scattered around the Pacific to be erupting at the same time, because they are all individual expressions of the same vast, interconnected belt of tectonic plate boundaries, and yet each one of them is running on its own separate local clock, driven by its own local supply of magma. Volcanoes that are thousands of kilometers apart, sitting on entirely different and unconnected tectonic systems, are not physically wired together. They do not take their cue from one another. They are not coordinating. A cluster in our attention, a lot of volcanoes in the news at once, is not the same thing at all as a cluster in cause. We are simply, this particular month, noticing a lot of them at the same time, and that distinction, the difference between a cluster of attention and a cluster of cause, is exactly what disarms the more conspiratorial version of this whole story. The version that says a record eruption is being deliberately hidden from you, that there is some kind of media blackout, that someone somewhere is actively keeping this from the public. There is no blackout. Let me be completely direct about this. The data that this entire video has been built upon, the volcanic activity reports, the earthquake catalogue entries, the satellite imagery from Himawari 9, all of it is openly published and freely available to anyone in the world who wants to go and look at it. Nobody buried it. Nobody hid it. The reason it has not reached you, until now, until this video, is not suppression. It is the far more mundane, far more ordinary reality that a remote cameraless eruption occurring during an exceptionally busy volcanic month does not generate headlines on its own momentum. The absence of coverage here is a blind spot. It is not a cover-up. And blind spots are not sinister things. They are not evidence of a plot. They are simply the places where the spotlight of human attention happens, for ordinary reasons not to be pointed. And there is something genuinely worth noticing about the way the conspiracy framing gets the story exactly backwards. The instinct behind it is not unreasonable. It comes from a real and healthy place, a suspicion that important things get hidden, that powerful institutions do not always tell the public everything. But applied here, that instinct points in precisely the wrong direction. Because the truth of Titan Ridge is not that information is being suppressed. The truth is the opposite. The information is sitting right out in the open, published by volcano observatories and earthquake monitoring agencies and weather satellites, free for anyone to read, and almost nobody is bothering to go and read it. The problem is not a locked door. The problem is an open door that no one is walking through. And that is, in a way, a more interesting and more solvable problem than a conspiracy would be. You cannot personally break a cover-up, but you can absolutely walk through an open door. You can choose to point your own attention at the blind spots. That is, in the end, a far more empowering version of the story than the conspiratorial one. And it has the considerable advantage of being true. But here is the thing about blind spots. And here, really, is the entire reason this video exists at all. A blind spot is precisely, exactly, where the genuinely interesting science tends to hide. While the cameras of the world were all pointed elsewhere, at the volcanoes that photograph well, a volcano on the dark floor of the Bismarck Sea has spent more than 2 weeks doing something that may, right now, at this very moment, be adding a brand new piece of land to the surface of planet Earth. Think, honestly, about how rare that is. The creation of new permanent geography is not something that happens on a human schedule or for human convenience. Most people will live their entire lives from birth to death without a single new island being born anywhere on the planet during their lifetime. And there is a real, serious, evidence-backed possibility that one is being born right now, in near total silence, in an unwatched corner of the sea, while the rest of the world looks the other way. That is not a small thing. That is not a footnote. That is one of the rarest and most profound processes that our planet ever runs, possibly unfolding in real time tonight. And the only reason we get to know about it at all, the only reason any of us can even have this conversation, is that a small handful of instruments, the infrasound sensors, the seismographs, the patient unblinking eye of the satellite, never stopped listening and never stopped watching. So let me land this exactly where it belongs. Here is what we can say with real confidence on the 22nd of May 2026. The eruption at Titan Ridge is real. It is ongoing. After more than 2 weeks, it is not fading. It is expanding. The close observers who have actually been tracking it consider it potentially the largest volcanic eruption of the year so far. It is producing rafts of fresh rock that drift across the open sea. It sits above a vent that the limited, imperfect data we have suggests is shallow. And beneath all of it, an earthquake swarm has been climbing, steadily, consistently the wrong way, for 14 straight days. And now here is what we honestly, genuinely cannot say. We cannot tell you whether a new island will break the surface of the sea, because the one single measurement that would settle that question, a precise, reliable depth for that vent, has never been made for this forgotten patch of ocean. And we cannot tell you whether the climbing swarm is a system that will safely vent away its energy, or a system that is loading toward a larger and more dangerous event. Both of those questions are, tonight, genuinely and completely open, and both of them will be answered, in the end, not by our speculation but by data, by the satellite imagery and the seismic records of the coming days and the coming weeks. There is a thought worth holding on to here, something that goes a little beyond the geology. We move through our lives with a quiet, unexamined assumption that the world is finished, that the map is done, that the continents and the islands and the coastlines are simply the fixed stage on which everything else happens, a backdrop that was settled long before we arrived and will be there long after we leave. And on the timescale of a human life, that assumption is almost always safe. The map does not visibly change. But it is not actually true. The world is not finished. The planet is still under construction, still molten at its heart, still pushing up mountains and tearing open rifts and, every so often, in some unwatched corner of an ocean, building something genuinely new. Most of that construction happens too slowly for us to perceive, or too far away, or too deep. But every now and then a piece of it surfaces into a timescale we can actually witness. And that is what may be happening at Titan Ridge. For a few weeks in the Central Bismarck Sea, the slow, ancient, ongoing project of building the surface of the Earth may have sped up just enough and surfaced just close enough for human beings to watch it happen. That is rare. That is worth not missing. That is the strange and genuine privilege of this particular moment in time. We are watching, in something very close to real time, a piece of our own planet possibly rearranging itself, an island being born, or a hazard being assembled. Or perhaps, quietly and undramatically, neither of those things. Perhaps just a volcano that, in the end, simply subsides back down into the dark, having built nothing more than a mountain that no human eye will ever see. We do not get to know which yet. We have not earned that answer yet. What we get to do, right now, is watch. And watching, paying close attention to the quiet signals in the blind spots, noticing the things that the cameras of the world miss, caring about the unwatched corner of the map, that is the entire reason this channel exists. The Central Bismarck Sea is not finished telling this story, not even close. The next chapter of it is already being written, right now, in satellite imagery that has not yet been captured, and in earthquakes that have not yet happened. And when that next chapter finally arrives, when we at last find out whether the Pacific Ocean has quietly gained itself a brand new island, or whether it has shown us something far more serious, we will be right here, watching the water, exactly the way we have been for the last 2 weeks. So keep your own eyes on that empty, unremarkable patch of distant ocean, because as you now know, it is not anywhere near as empty as it looks.